Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our afternoon health symposium. The topic today is about stress response and infection of fear. Our presenter, our Dr. Wecker, was born in Saskatchewan but has been practicing family medicine for the last 46 years, the 35 of which were spent in New Brunswick. Dr. Wecker is a traveler, having visited 165 of the world's 196 countries. He lived cumulatively in Rwanda and Kenya, East Africa, and Cote d'Ivoire, West Africa, for 7 years. Most people who pursue a Master of Public Health degree have a strong interest in preventive medicine and public good. Dr. Wecker is one of those people. He is married with 4 adult children. Today, we are grateful that he has chosen to be with us to share his vast knowledge. We present to you Dr. Wecker.
Okay, good afternoon. Yeah, my 4 children, my oldest son, unfortunately, is going to be 50 years old in 2 weeks. Maybe I should say fortunately, but it just makes me feel very old. He and his wife live in Hong Kong. They have 2 boys. The oldest one, who is now 18 and going to be a senior in academy. Russell is an IT fella who was the IT director for the Atlantic Union, based out of Lancaster, Massachusetts for many years, and then they decided to go back overseas because they wanted their boys to have an Asian experience. His wife is Malaysian, and they're currently teaching at an academy in Hong Kong. And Lihan is the finance manager there. My oldest daughter, Sarah, and her husband, they live in Vancouver, Washington. Sarah is a physiotherapist with also a very strong interest in functional medicine and alternative medicine. Just a very intuitive practitioner who I learn a lot from on a daily basis. And then our 3rd child is an IT guy as well. The boy's in IT, the girl's in health. And he lives in Calgary, where he's working on his PhD in computer graphics. And when I read his articles, they are in a foreign language. I have no idea what he's talking about. And then our youngest daughter also lives in Calgary, and she is a doctor of traditional Chinese medicine and has a very good, flourishing practice in Calgary, and would like to move east at some point in time. She misses the east. She loves to garden, and I don't know whether you know it, but today the forecast in Western Alberta was snow. All the way down from Cochrane to the border with Montana. She says no matter when you try to garden, it invariably freezes out or hails out. And Calgary can get snow 365 days a year, so she's wanting to move east. Anyhow, along with those, we have a bunch of collected kids, okay, that are just greatly part of our family from a variety of countries. Young man living in Gatineau who we put through Laval University was the son of my accountant when I worked for Adventist Health Services in Rwanda. He is a member of the Gatineau Church, and so I'll be seeing him. We haven't seen him since COVID broke out, so I'll be spending the last part of this week with them. Kuda, my Zimbabwean son, who lives in now Mississauga doing an internship, has just been a real good part of our life. His wife is a physician. She's at McGill doing a master's degree in medical research. He's at UNB, University of New Brunswick, doing a doctorate in materials engineering. And that's another one that when I read his papers he writes, it's in a totally foreign language. So, let's go on with our topic tonight. And tonight, the subject is a little bit complicated, and I will try to simplify it as best I can. But we're going to start out with stress. Stress has existed since the beginning of time. And so I'll put on this slide here, the stress response. And stress is an integral part of life. We all have stress. Stress is normal. And at first, it was designed to be a defense mechanism to protect us from danger and to help us to cope with new situations. It's an adaptation reaction to our environment, and it enables us to maintain an internal balance that we call homeostasis, where we can maintain sort of a status quo in our bodies. So for our rural ancestors who lived in the forests and savannas of the world, there were wild animals, there were enemies around, there were climactic challenges, and they adapted to their environment because of the stress response. And so for them, the alarm phase, and we're going to look at the phases of the stress response, the alarm phase allowed them to fight or flee, and in order to avoid a danger or a threat. And this collection of reactions to the perception of danger is something that we have inherited from our ancestors. But times have changed. Today, we're no longer usually threatened by wild animals. They threaten my garden, but they don't threaten me. But rather than that, it's a pile of work that's on our desk with a timetable to get it done. It's a struggle to improve our performance because we've gotten a negative job review in our job. It's new technology that is being required and which we feel uncomfortable with, especially those of us in an older generation who didn't grow up with the technology. Most of us have to ask our grandchildren to fix it for us. Sometimes it's travel on the 417 or the 401. Sometimes it's an employee, a fellow employee, or a fellow coworker who is not easy to get along with. But our organism has not changed in the way in which it deals with stress. It still functions in the same way. So the stress response system has no idea that we're in the 21st century. It still thinks that we need to prepare to being run away from a bear or a lion or something. And it doesn't know the difference between running away from a lion and being stuck in a gridlock on a freeway. In both situations, the same hormones are secreted, the same reaction takes place, and it has the same effect on our brains and our bodies. Stress. Oh, I got to do the right one there. So there's one of the sources of stress. There's another source of stress. Someone entering our home in the middle of the night. And I don't know if you heard the news this past week about this fellow that was on the loose in Saskatchewan. And there were 8 or 9 people killed. And ultimately, a lady was in her home in Waukesha, Saskatchewan, and she saw him coming to her door. So she locked her door, she locked her bedroom door, she locked her bathroom door, and she ran into her bathroom with her phone and called the RCMP. He broke down the door to her house, he broke down the door to her bedroom and to her bathroom, and asked her to go with him. She refused, but she survived. Because she called the RCMP, they were able to track him down, and they arrested him outside of Rostern, Saskatchewan, and brought an end to that spree of killing. Can you imagine the stress hormones that were flowing in that lady's brain and her body during that experience? So faced with the demands of everyday life, the stress response, activated repeatedly or chronically, becomes a danger to our health. Our reactions to stress are excessive. Our adaptational systems are stressed to their limit. Our threshold of tolerance is worn out, and organisms cannot tolerate chronic stress. So there is the stress response, vital and beneficial to everyone, which is poorly adapted to modern life in Canada, and it now wears us out and finishes by making us sick. Stress, which was a friend in the past, has become public enemy number one to the modern person. So what takes place in the brain when we are afraid? Remember the old fire alarms that we used to use when we were kids? I will come back to that one there. There's one of the causes of modern stress right there. There's the next one for modern stress. That was me yesterday on the 417. There's another one for modern stress. Debt, another cause for stress. A timeline we can't meet, middle of the night, cup of coffee. And we're going to come to these pictures here. I had another one. This is the one I wanted to show you. You remember those old fire alarms? When I don't know if many of you can remember them. The younger ones you probably can't. These were on the corners of our streets when I was growing up. We learned where they were, and if there was a fire, we would run down there and have to pull the box and alert the fire department. I always wanted to be able to pull one of those, but I never managed to get the courage up. I was too well-behaved of a kid, I guess. Well, our brain has a firebox like that, and it's called the amygdala. And let me see if I can... I appreciate the way this is set up tonight. Last night it was a little bit disconcerting to me with the screen behind me. So there's the amygdala right there, that little part in the center of the brain. And that is the equivalent to the fire alarm. It's what signals that there's something going wrong. At school, once the fire alarm is activated, several things happen. First of all, there was a fire alarm that rang in the building to get everyone out of the building. Did you guys have fire drills when you were in school? Yeah, so did we. It was kind of an exciting time. And it also notifies the 911 operator. Just as the fire alarm does, the amygdala stimulates the secretion of adrenaline from the adrenal glands to get the attention of the entire body. It notifies the 911 operator, which is called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus, I don't have it marked on there, but it's very near the amygdala. And the hypothalamus sends a message to the radio tower, which is the pituitary gland. And what I'll do is I'll just advance the slide here. Maybe we'll see it a little bit better. And the pituitary gland in the center there, right at the center of the brain, secretes a hormone to stimulate the production of cortisol, and it also stimulates the production of adrenaline or epinephrine. Instead of sending a radio message, the pituitary gland secretes these hormones, these stress hormones. When the fire department arrives at the school, the fire chief surveys the situation and decides whether he needs to call other units or what he needs to do to get control of the fire. And the hippocampus, which is pituitary glands there, hypothalamus there. I guess this doesn't have the hippocampus in there. Another part of the brain, it acts like the fire chief. It has receptors to cortisone, which follow the level of the stress hormones, and they say, we've got enough help, or we need more help. The director of the brain is found in the front of the brain, right up there in that prefrontal cortex, and it functions like the school principal, who has to decide whether there really was a fire or whether it was a false alarm. If there is a real fire, the principal notifies 911 operator and the fire department's notified. If it's a false alarm, the principal notifies the 911 operator that the situation is under control and the fire trucks stay in the department. The stress hormones that we have are basically 3 or 4. We have adrenaline, noradrenaline, and all the different steroids like cortisol. So, you're walking across the lawn and you see something moving in the grass. Let's see, I'm going to try and keep up to date with my slides. Adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisone. You're walking across the grass and you see something black and slithering in the grass. Immediately, the alarm rings with your amygdala. If you're a New Brunswicker, it's terrible. The amygdala calls 911, and the 911 operator calls the fire department, which is the pituitary gland. It rings the bell at the fire station. The entire station springs into action. In the brain, the pituitary gland secretes hormones. The adrenal glands start producing adrenaline, and the pancreas secretes insulin so that your blood sugar can be used better, your heart rate increases, your breathing increases, blood moves away from the stomach into the muscles so you can run, your blood pressure increases, and the body prepares to get away. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex starts to work. And in the grass, you discover a garden hose. Oh, the whole system starts to quiet down. Oh, yeah, I know. The response was growing already. So you see the fire hose, and so the fireman calls a false alarm, and the whole system starts to shut down. Whew, a close call. Stress is a feeling of physical or emotional tension. It can come from any experience or any event or situation that makes you feel frustrated, angry, or nervous. It's your body's response to a challenge, a change, or a demand. And like I said, in short bursts, it's very helpful, especially if you have a deadline to meet or you need to avoid danger. But we no longer live in the forest surrounded by the wild animals. And so we have all the stress factors that we had talked about. And that one, it's not easy to see, but we have physical stresses, which could be an illness, psychological stresses, a difficult colleague, a debt that we're having a difficult time paying. We have social stresses, a broken relationship, a divorce, a death in the family, a death of a close friend. And we have spiritual stresses. We make moral mistakes and we're afraid that we're going to be punished for our sins, and a fear of hell and whatever our concept of punishment is. We have sort of a modified vegetarian form of hell in the Adventist church whereby we will only burn for as long as our sins are there, and then it goes out. As we've seen before, the stress response is normal and physiological, necessary for our survival, intended only to last for a few moments or a couple of hours. But when this stress response is prolonged, it becomes disease-causing and destructive. And the longer that the stress is in effect, the stronger the deleterious effect. Now, there are 3 phases to dealing with long-term stress, 3 phases to adaptation to long-term stress. Our first phase is the alarm reaction. Alarm is the instantaneous response to any situation, whether it's a mental stress, where it's a physical stress, where it's a physiological change. I had noticed that when I was doing my yearly checkup myself, that I had a little bit of blood in my urine. So I thought, well, I'm going to order another test, okay? So I'm going to see if there are any abnormal cells in there. So the report came back, and in great big letters, it says, urgent, rule out malignancy, need to contact a urologist. Immediately, the stress response hit. I got sweaty. I couldn't focus. I was in the office. I didn't know how I was going to deal with any of the patients that were in the office that afternoon. I just knew that my life was coming to an end. Fortunately, my prefrontal cortex was able to take control. I decided to call my urologist friend, and he laughed. He said, "What did you order that test for in the first place? You shouldn't have done it. How long have you had little bits of blood in your urine?" I said, "Well, a long time, many years. It's just more this time than usual." He said, "I'll check you out," but he said, "You shouldn't have ordered the test, and don't worry about it." False alarm. Oh, just in having said that, was able to relax, was able to get back to working with my afternoon again. So this alarm phase is this first phase that takes place. And this activation is responsible for the increase in heart rate, blood pressure, muscle tension, release of glucose, release of insulin, and these well-known effects when we're exposed to danger. A few years ago, I decided that I was going to read some of the classics that I'd never read before. It was midsummer. My wife and children had gone to camp meeting for a while, and I sat down late one evening and started reading the book Dracula. Well, it was about 1 o'clock in the morning when 2 tomcats started to fight outside my window, and there was a horrid noise. And I'll tell you, I jumped that far off the chair. And I was in this rather scary part of the book Dracula, and immediately this whole alarm reaction took place in my body. I was just trembling when these 2 tomcats screaming outside my window at 1 o'clock in the morning. I was alone in the house. I don't remember the last time that I had to turn the lights on to get through the house. I know the house in the dark and I could walk through it, but not this night. I said, "Okay, it's enough. I'm going to bed." And every light went on as I walked through the house until I got to the bedroom. And I laughed at myself. I thought, that is so silly. And yet, that's this alarm response that we get. Fear of an intruder, or something that just takes over. Once the threat is eliminated, once I realized there were tomcats fighting, the parasympathetic nervous system took over and there was a return to a normal state, though I had to turn the lights on to get to the bedroom. Now, the second phase here is called the resistance phase, okay? Right in there. And this phase is usually a little bit more prolonged. The organism will enter, if the stress is prolonged, the organism will enter into this second phase, the resistance phase. It's during this phase that the stress response begins to cause long-term effects and damage our bodies. The entire body kicks into gear. It mobilizes the production of energy. Stress hormones are secreted. The duration of this phase is related to the intensity and duration of the stressful situation and the ability of the body to adapt. It is in the release of cortisone in this phase that causes the emotional distress, which we feel as anxiety, fear, worry, internal malaise that just something isn't right, anguish, fatigue, digestive trouble. You know, that knot in the pit of your stomach. Oh, there's just something that's not right. Muscle tension, spasm, difficulty to concentrate, memory problems, loss of motivation, sleep disturbance. I'm sure we all know some of those symptoms because we all live in this resistance phase many times. Then, if the stress continues further, we move into the exhaustion phase. And this is the cause of repetitive stress, chronic stress. And here the organism is no longer able to cope. We start falling apart. It demands a large expenditure of energy. Our energy sources become depleted. We enter into a survival mode. This is the part where we get chronic fatigue, where people just have no energy. They can't move on with anything in their lives. Ultimately, with these hormones being secreted, we end up with fibromyalgia, where we get muscle soreness and muscle pain that just continues. There are other diseases that can occur. Asthma can occur, eczema, accelerated aging, various cancers, depression, even so severe that it can lead to suicide. I remember in 1962 my father, who was a builder, we were building a new church in the city of Regina. And my dad took over a fair amount of the construction of this new church. And so he would work all day for his own business, and then he spent until late at night working on the church. And he got exhausted. The stress level was intense, young family at home, and he developed asthma, severe asthma. Asthma so severe that he would collapse between his truck and the house, and we'd have to go out with inhalers. And of course, in that day and age, it was before many of the modern things that we treat it with. His asthma was directly the result of this stress problem. So this exhaustion phase is an important phase, and one in which we all can find ourselves into. And today I see more and more people who are in that zone related to chronic unresolved stress. So basically, I wanted to just outline in this first part how this all works, okay? Because this pathway that gets activated by these various causes is one of the reasons why we have all the mental, not all, many of the mental problems that we have in this day and age. And so we need to find ways to manage stress without distress. And the Montreal neurophysiologist Hans Selye, about 50 years ago, wrote a book called Stress Without Distress. And he outlined what was happening in the 1960s in Canada, around the world, with chronic long-term stress and how it was affecting the body. So some of this information is now 60 years old, and we're just learning how to deal with it. Before I move on, are there any questions about this stress response? Anything that you don't understand that I didn't explain clearly enough? I'm going to go on to this next slide here, which symptoms of the resistance phase: worry, fear, anxiety, sleep disturbance, palpitations, internal malaise, palpitations I put in twice, muscle tension and spasm, difficulty concentrating, and memory issues. So just okay, we'll move into part 2, which is the infection of fear. Fear is an intruder, like an unnatural invader, like flesh-eating bacteria. It ravages and deforms all of creation. As soon as Adam believed the lies that Satan told him about God, and the circle of love and trust was broken, fear infected the human heart. Fueled by fear and selfishness, the imagination of men ran wild and created every distorted, twisted, perverted idea about God, and that even incited more fear. And there are several texts that we can go to that will explain that. And I wonder, do I have? Yeah, so the infection of fear. Fear is an intruder. It ravages and destroys all creation, and it consumes until we die. And love, health, and happiness can only be found where love flows freely. Today, fear is stalking all of us. It's stalking us in the shadows of our minds. We've just finished a pandemic, COVID-19, and it was a good demonstration of what fear does to us in our society, a way that I never thought I would see until it all unfolded. We have the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Beyond my understanding and belief how one man and his erroneous ideas can cause so much misery and destruction. We have the threat of nuclear war with the power plant in in Ukraine that's being bombed and shot at, and they've had to shut it down. We've got the threat of civil war in our neighbor to the south of us. We've got rampant inflation, rapidly rising costs of fuel and food. We have more people going to food banks now in Canada than ever in its history. There's a lot of uncertainty today. We may beat it back for a few moments, but it lurks in the darkness of our hearts. It doesn't wait for an invitation. It barges into our lives. It tramples our world like cattle trampling over daisies. I'm not talking about adaptive alertness like when we're needing this stress response. I'm talking about fear, innate internal fear, this noxious uneasiness that boils inside of us, threatening to destroy our happiness. We run from it, but it propels us forward as we search, grope, and hope for relief. But fear only leads to more pain. Fear is part of a breakdown of trust, what we in religion call sin. It leads us away from God, away from healing, away from peace, and into further self-destruction. Fear comes in many sizes and shapes. At one end of the fear spectrum are the megalomaniacs: Hitler, Stalin, Idi Amin, Pol Pot, Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and other despots. Their rise to power is fueled by fear. Fear of Jews, fear of gypsies, fear of Slavs, fear of Christians, fear of Muslims, fear of Nazis. And we see that in our country even today. It's increasing in our country today instead of decreasing. Such miserable people in history were consumed with fear. Rather than eradicate it, they embraced it, they joined their hearts to it, they became one with it, and fear became their weapon against society, splitting, dividing, conquering, and destroying. These ambassadors of evil, with hearts and minds so shaped by the opposite of love, have created mangled societies battered by fear. The United States is moving in that direction right now, and we in Canada are not far behind. And history is clear. Where fear abounds, death soon follows. At the other end of the spectrum, from the megalomaniac, is the human mouse, afraid of rejection, fearful of embarrassment, terrified of criticism. People made meek by fear, abasing themselves into doormats to be walked on by everyone in the world. They never say no. They never stand up. They never set boundaries because they're controlled by fear of what others might say or how others might respond and think. And in between these two extremes, we have all manner of fear-ridden situations, insecurity, fear that are unique to our own survival mechanisms. We have the playground bully, the proud, the arrogant, the racist, the bigot, the sexist. You find the alcoholic, the drug addict, the sex addict, the shopaholic, the religious fundamentalist, the members of a cult, the separatist, the philanderer, the liar, the cheater, the fraud, each motivated by fear, each one seeking to protect oneself, to promote oneself, or to advance oneself. But rather than surviving, rather than healing, rather than growing, they are all slowly dying and destroying others in the process. Life, health, and happiness are only found where love flows freely. And love only flows freely where the truth about our God is known. The constant firing of our anxiety system occurs in brains which are out of balance, and it's an overreaction to environmental stimuli. Because of sin, all of our brains are out of balance to some degree, and we all experience far too frequently these symptoms of out-of-control stress, of the amygdala firing. Evolutionary biologists suggest that this fight or flight response is a very adaptive reaction that promotes survival in the face of immediate crisis. But it's the firing of this alarm system that damages the brain, impairs healthy thinking, and abuses the body. And the longer the alarm fires, the more the damage occurs. So here's the bottom line. When fear increases, love, growth, development, and healthy thinking decreases. When love increases, not only does fear decrease, but growth, development, and healthy thinking all improve. Fear and love are inversely proportional. It is in our prefrontal cortex where we have the ability to love healthfully, have compassion, have care for others, empathy, reasoning capacity, judgment, the ability to worship, conscientiousness, morality, the ability to plan, organize, problem solve. That's the area of the brain that we need to strengthen. The fear, insecurity, selfishness, anger, rage, lust, jealousy, envy, and aggression arise from constantly stimulating our limbic system. Let me see what our next one is here. No, I'm going to come back to that one. So, one possible avenue for anxiety to be instigated is a pre-birth effect on the brain. Brain development occurs during pregnancy. And I often say that if we're born with 10 billion brain cells, and say the brain develops at a constant rate over pregnancy, which it doesn't, every second that a woman is pregnant, we are creating millions of brain cells. Every second. I remember a lady I interviewed once in Rwanda. I said to her, "What did you eat yesterday?" She said, "Ibijumba," which is sweet potatoes. I said, "Only sweet potatoes?" "No, only sweet potatoes." "What did you eat the day before yesterday?" "Sweet potatoes." "Nothing more than sweet potatoes?" "No." "What did you eat the day before that?" "Sweet potatoes." "How long have you been just eating sweet potatoes?" 3 months. She was 6 months pregnant. And I wonder what the result on that child was going to be that was born. We don't realize how a stressful pregnancy influences the long-term development of that child. Imagine today some of the stresses that pregnant women are under. No supportive relationship, perhaps as a teenager. The whole gamut is there. They're under a tremendous amount of stress. And I just feel sorry. It's rare that I see a pregnancy in a happy, well-adjusted, committed couple anymore. And I'm just really concerned about the future of our society if this continues. If a mother has high stress levels, the body releases stress hormones, the cortisol and adrenaline. They cross the placenta and they affect the developing brain. They impair the braking system on the amygdala of the growing brain, which means that a child born to a high-stress mother will have a brain that is less capable to calm itself and turn off the circuitry. And we're going to discuss that more when we get to ADD and ADHD later this week, which is increasing epidemically. Such children start life from a baseline that is more anxious and fearful than they would otherwise have experienced. At birth, the baby's brain contains hundreds of millions more neurons than it will have when it's 8 years old. And I mentioned that last night. For the first 8 years of life, the brain is busy killing off neurons by the hundreds of millions. First, this doesn't sound like it's too productive. But think of it like Michelangelo's block of marble. He starts with a big block, and as he works, he chips away at the marble until he ends up with the statue of David. but he had to do that by chipping it away. When the artist is finished with the marble, he has less marble, but he has a masterpiece. The brain comes into the world prepared to be acted on by education, environment, experience, and neurons by the millions are waiting to be retrained, strengthened, and expanded. But those neural circuits that are not used become pruned, deleted, or reassigned. When a child is loved, the area of the brain which secretes oxytocin, that hormone of well-being, a bonding hormone, develops, and the child is able to connect with other people and build deep personal relationships much easier than the child who has never been touched or loved. Kamala was reportedly found living with wolves by a missionary, J.A. Singh, when the child was 8 years of age. She could not speak, but made inarticulate howling sounds, walked on all fours, and lapped her food like a dog. Despite living for 9 more years, she never learned to speak more than 50 words. Profoundly influenced by her first experiences. Jeannie was locked inside a room at 20 months of age and lived the next 11 years of her life in solitary confinement. When she was rescued at age 13, she was profoundly disabled, and despite intensive rehabilitation efforts, never ever learned to speak. These tragic cases demonstrate the normal brain processes. Neural circuits that are not used are pruned and deleted. Those that are used are strengthened and developed and expanded. And this happens throughout the entire brain. Therefore, activities that repeatedly and regularly excite the amygdala, the alarm center, during childhood, enhance its development and impair the growth of the prefrontal cortex. And these people are always concerned, worried, and fearful. Theatrical programming, which is not to be confused with educational programming, has a primary effect of firing the limbic system. And it simultaneously decreases the prefrontal cortex. Theatrical entertainment is designed to get an emotional response from the audience. And the more powerful the emotional reaction, the better the program. Such programs want to get you to laugh, cry, be afraid, be aroused, angry, irritated, frustrated, and they simultaneously turn off your critical thinking. And this type of programming has a similar effect on most human brains. But children between birth and 8 years of age are particularly vulnerable to this massive stimulation of the nerves of the amygdala during this time. Studies have shown that the more theatrical entertainment children view during the first 8 years of life, the greater difficulty they will have with attention, focus, concentration, higher rates of violence, impulsive behavior, sexual acting out, increased anxiety, and mood problems. Sadly, many parents, the mainstream media, and even church groups have wrongly concluded that the problem is content-driven. The old adage, garbage in, garbage out, has been used by many a well-meaning preacher to discourage bad content. While it's absolutely appropriate to avoid bad content, the problem is that theatrical entertainment is not content-driven. The issue is a neurodevelopmental problem. In other words, watching G-rated theatrical entertainment will damage the developing brain. So I will go on to my next slide here. And this shows the year that television was introduced in a particular country. And it will show what happened to the homicide rate in that country. So in Canada, it was introduced in 1945, and we had an increase of 92% in our homicide rate. United States, the same thing. South Africa didn't introduce television until 1972. And between 45 and 72, they had a minus 7% decrease in the homicide rate, whereas from 1972 on, they had a 130% increase. It's directly related to what we allow our children to watch. Theatrical entertainment stimulates the amygdala and inhibits the prefrontal cortex, and the result is that our brains are out of balance. It is rare today that I have a child that comes into my office that is not severely hyperactive. If they are unattended by a member of my staff, they are into every cupboard, every drawer. They're taking all the exam gloves out of the box and blowing them up like balloons. They're building houses with the tongue depressors. They're jumping and running around the room. And the parent sits there and watches it unfazed. When I was a child and I went into the doctor's office, I sat in my underwear very carefully on the table there, waiting for the doctor to come in, just looking in all directions, but didn't budge. One of my employees, although she's no longer working with me, she's now taking a degree in massage therapy, has 4 children, and she's just one phenomenal parent. And when her 4 children come in, they sit like birds on a wire on the table. They are gracious, they are polite, they answer questions. One of them had to go to the emergency department for a laceration, and when the doctor came in and was going to give the anesthetic to sew up the laceration, he said, well, I'm just going to put this needle in to help numb it up so I can sew it. And the little 4-year-old said, I know, my mother's explained it to me already. I know it's going to sting a little bit, but I can handle it, and I will sit quietly. 4 years old. Wow, the doctor that was in the emergency department didn't know what to do with a child to behave normally. And the 4-year-old is now about 8 in school, and his mother told me that he's in love with Africa. He just wants to read and learn everything he can about Africa. So the other day he was in, and I said, well, I hear you're interested in Africa. He says, yes, and I know that you go to Africa regularly. And I said, yep, and as soon as you're able to travel alone without your mom, I'll take you to Africa. He said, you will? Oh, I can hardly wait. Great, great kid. So this overstimulation causes these problems. While theatrical entertainment negatively impacts brain development, childhood trauma is even more damaging. Dr. Andrea Denise and her team followed 800 individuals for 32 years to determine the impact of childhood stress on mental and physical health. They identified 3 aspects of childhood stress that were particularly damaging: physical or sexual abuse, neglect, and socioeconomic deprivation, poor children who lacked the basic necessities. The results showed that the more childhood stress, the higher the incidence of depression, inflammatory conditions, and diseases later on in life. The study concluded that children exposed to adverse psychosocial experiences have enduring emotional, immune, and metabolic abnormalities that contribute to their elevated rates of disease later on in their life. The importance of proper environment for our children. Wow. I'm no longer a parent of young children, and my grandchildren are even growing up. But I just would like to go back and relive my early childhood years, and I know I would do things differently than I did. So children raised in high-stress, low-nurturing, abusive environments experience an overdevelopment of their fear centers and an underdevelopment of their reason, love, and judgment centers. They experience greater levels of stress hormones throughout development, which results in a greater vulnerability to a variety of chronic diseases: depression, inflammatory disease, metabolic diseases. There are brain changes. These people have difficulty with empathy, compassion, trust, altruistic love, sympathizing with others, patience, and overall healthy relationships. According to the National Institute of Medical Health, anxiety disorders are the most common mental health problem in Canada, affecting almost 30% of our population. 30%. And the rate of anxiety disorders is rising every year. When the fear center of the brain, the amygdala, is activated and not calmed down, it triggers this whole cascade of events, this stress cascade. And it also triggers inflammatory factors such as cytokines, and this wreaks havoc in the body, creates illness and pain. One of the last things I want to explain today is, I alluded to it last night, it's called BNDF, okay? And BNDF stands for a protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And this is really brain fertilizer. When this protein is available, the brain cells can grow stronger and send out more connections to other cells. The brain even can make new nerve cells under the influence of BNDF protein. When this protein is available in the right brain regions, we can learn faster and easier. When this protein and other proteins like it are unavailable, the brain stops making new cells, and the brain cells start to wither and die. In the brain, the white matter that I showed you last night, the supporting cells that surround the neurons like an astronaut's spacesuit, these are called glial cells. And just as the astronaut spacesuit provides a safe environment for the astronaut, the white cells that surround the nerve cells and all the connections bathe the neurons in rich nutritional fluids. And not only do these neurons themselves make the BDNF, but the supporting cells also make BDNF to keep the nerve cells healthy. The persistent rise in inflammation factors resulting from chronic fear and anxiety cause several problems to the brain. It damages these white brain cells, the glial cells. There's the stress response, the fight or flight response. It shuts down growth by suppressing BDNF, and learning and development become impaired. The chronic stress signal causes a message to be transmitted to the DNA of brain cells, and they turn off the production of BDNF. Now, we've got another interesting thing, which we won't have time to talk about much this week, but it's called epigenetics. And epigenetics shows how environmental factors can affect our genetic expression significantly. And I'll give you just a quick example to explain what epigenetics is. They took some rats and they exposed them to the smell of menthol. And at the same time that they exposed them to the menthol, they gave them an injection to boost their immune system. And very shortly thereafter, when they just exposed the rats to the menthol smell, their immune systems got stronger without the injection. Okay, that's the Pavlov stimulus and response in action. But what was surprising is the next generation of rats didn't have to have the injection, just the smell of the menthol caused the immune system to get stronger. And in fact, it was 3 generations before it suddenly started to wear off. So then they decided to do the opposite. They exposed rats to menthol and they suppressed the immune system. Before long, just the smell of menthol would suppress the immune system. And just the same way, the next generation, The smell of menthol suppressed the immune system. The third generation, the same thing. So these, just because we have a genetic predisposition to a disease, heart disease, cancer, breast cancer, whatever, does not mean that we will necessarily get that disease. It depends on something in our environment which can turn off that gene or turn on the expression of that gene. So there are things we can do to alter what we were born with, the tendencies and predispositions that we were born with. This is exciting information because many of us have felt rather victimized by what we were born with, what our parents gave us for genes. I have patients that come in and say, well, my mother worried all the time and my father worried all the time, and therefore I worry all the time just like my mother and my father, you know? And I just say, well, you don't have to. Well, it's a family trait. It runs in the family. Yeah. Remember neuroplasticity? That can be changed. As we exercise healthy habits, the brain can change and health can be restored to the brain. So what's God's method for healing brains? God's method for increasing brain health and nurturing mental stability, if they're applied, the brain circuits of the prefrontal cortex grow stronger, and despite previous damage, healing ensues. Healthy connections in the brain grow and develop. So if you are someone who has had abuse during your childhood, or if you've struggled with an overly active limbic system because there's been too much aggression and irritability and impatience, anger, lust, selfishness, fear, insecurity, don't be discouraged. God's methods can bring healing to our brains. And the most important aspect to this is the fact that when we are exposed to a loving, nurturing, caring environment, these aspects start to decrease. And really, isn't that what our church should be? Shouldn't it be a place of healing? A place where I call it church is the lab for Christianity 101. You can't be a good Christian totally alone because it's all about relationships. There has to be more than one. Probably the strongest supporting evidence for Trinity is this fact that if God is love, there has to be more than one part to God. Scripturally, we struggle with proving Trinity from texts. But just the mere fact that God is love means that there has to be someone who loves and someone who receives, and it flows in this circuit. And our church is where we put this into practice. In our community. Do we have difficult people in our community? Absolutely. Do we have people we struggle to get along with? Absolutely. But as we put these things into practice and we create an environment of safety, like we talked about this morning, of love, of acceptance, of working and praying with each other as we work and struggle with the complexities of life, we can be agents of God for bringing healing to our troubled, damaged brains. I'm going to back up my slide a little bit until where it says, life, health, and happiness are only found where love flows, and I put bad English there. It should be freely. And so one of the first areas that we need to talk about with healing of these damaged brains is just this. And I think that it would be such a wonderful idea if we as a group of Christians, instead of putting on revelation seminars about beasts and kingdoms and this sort of thing, if we talked about bringing compassion back in the church, helping our church become a loving, accepting, gracious, forgiving community. Just imagine what would happen. I think that's what we are called to be, is a community led by God's Spirit, empowered and commissioned to bring healing in a sick and damaged world. What do you think? Any questions?
Stress. What do you do with that? How do you get that?
How do you get rid of it? We're going to have a whole session on that. We're going to play a few little games with you one night, okay? Teaching you some stress reduction techniques, okay?
Good.
Yeah, there's a whole variety of things that we can do, you know, and I won't go into them too much tonight because we've got a whole evening where we're going to be talking about some of those things that we can do. But very good question. I'll tell you one little story, and I will get you to do this experiment with me on that night. But I was at a meeting in Boston a few years ago, and it was called, the meeting was on spirituality and health. And it was led by one of the professors at Harvard University. Very, very interesting program. And so one evening we were in a sort of a seminar room, a big room, and there were tables in the room, and every table had about 8 or 9 people sitting around it. And so I was at the table, and we just went around while we were waiting for the program to start, and we wondered what everybody did for an occupation. One lady at the table said, "Well, I do laughter therapy." We said, "Laughter therapy?" She said, "Yeah, have you ever tried it?" And we said, "No." Well, she said, "Would you like to try it?" We said, "Sure, why not?" I'm not going to give away too many secrets because we are going to try it one of these evenings. But there was one older psychiatrist in the group who was bound to determine that he was not going to laugh. And of course, we all started laughing, and pretty soon we started forcibly laughing, but then very quickly it came into spontaneous laughing, and all the other tables in the room were looking at us and wondering what was going on, and pretty soon they were all snickering. And this old codger, he just was bound and determined his face was going to break. And then all of a sudden we saw the corner of his mouth start to wiggle, and the table went wild. We were laughing to the point of almost being on the floor. And it had all started with laughter therapy. And the lady said to us when we were done, "How do you all feel now?" We said, "Fantastic." So I'm going to do that experiment with you one evening when we're looking at some of these mechanisms. But it was it was absolutely excellent. So there are a variety of things that we can do, and we'll go over them. Yeah.
You mentioned compassion, and that is giving compassion to others. What about this whole thing about self-compassion? There's that's the trend right now. There's a lot of courses about self-compassion, and I'm wondering what you think about that.
Well, who are we hardest on in our lives? We're hardest on ourselves, okay? I left here last night, and I was frustrated that I was not terribly well organized last night, and so I beat myself up all the way home, you know? It's hard on myself. We need to be compassionate with ourselves. And one of the reasons I bring this out is in the Wilderness Medical Society, or in the International Travel Medicine Society, we have a man who has been a leader there who worked in Nepal for a long time. And he was greatly influenced by the Buddhist religious tradition. And he ended up writing a book called Bringing Compassion Back into Medicine. And it was somewhat of a Buddhist perspective. And I got a copy of his book and I read it. And I thought, man, we need to have a seminar in the church about bringing compassion back into the church. You know, instead of being critical and condemnatory and judgmental with each other, bring this in. And we start with ourselves. We have to be compassionate with ourselves. Yes?
The reason that I asked that is because one of the things that we're, taught as Christians is not to focus on the self, right? Focus on others. So it just seemed to me that when we hear about self-compassion, that would...
is a reverse focus.
Yeah.
So what did Jesus do as all the crowds were there with all the people demanding healing and wanting free bread and all this sort of stuff? And what did he do? Got in the boat, headed across the lake, found himself a quiet place because he needed to reconnect with his Father, and he needed that time. We cannot give to someone else unless our own cup is full, okay? And so one of the big problems we have is that we can become so self-deprecating, so self-condemnatory that we have nothing to give to someone else. Remember that if Jesus Christ came and would given his life on the cross for me alone, I am worth something. And don't you miss Sabbath sermon next Sabbath. It's going to be perfect on that subject, okay? Good. Well,
I have a question.
Sure.
This morning, you had talked about, in regards to depression, doing like HIIT, high intensity exercise and whatnot. Now, that was for depression and for the mind. But that also applies for the body. And the previous evening, you had talked about there's an interconnection, mind, body, and spirit. Can you talk more about that? Like, maybe just using that as a reference, HIIT that touches upon the body, the mind, and when is there a best time to do it? Is it early in the morning or whenever you can?
It depends whether you're a night owl or a lark. If you're a lark, the best time in the morning is in the morning. I'm a lark. My wife is a night owl, and her best time is at night. So she always says that the saying, the early bird gets the worm, had no idea what they were talking about. She gets her worms at night. So it depends. And I always say to people, if you don't know whether you're a night owl or a lark, when you get up in the morning, are you hungry right away? When I get out of bed, I'm heading straight for breakfast. When my wife gets out of bed, she can't even look at food until 11 o'clock in the morning. But boy, after supper, she could eat clear up until midnight. So, yeah, there's a difference. But it's all interconnected. But remember that with exercise, there are several benefits from it, okay? But one of the benefits is getting your blood circulating, get your heart pumping, get your blood circulating to all the different parts of the body, okay? And when the brain, we're going to talk about that another evening, the brain requires two or three things constantly: oxygen, glucose, and healthy fats. The brain requires them to function. And if our brain loses oxygen for 8 minutes, it's dead. Our brain is so in need of glucose that, did you realize it's the only cells of the body that don't require insulin to get glucose into the cell? All the other cells require insulin. But if that was the case, diabetics would die before they were diagnosed. Okay? So fortunately, God has provided us with brains that don't need insulin to get glucose. Now, we're going to come to that again in one of the other evenings because every cell in the body is poisoned by high sugar levels. And so when we're a diabetic, our brain cells get poisoned by those high blood sugar levels. And it actually, that's why we're calling Alzheimer's disease type 3 diabetes. Yeah, we're going to come to that in another evening. But yeah, so, but the brain needs these three elements. We've also been on a fat-free diet for 50 years, which has damaged our brains because our brains are made of fat. Instead of being on a fat-free diet, we need to be on a healthy fat diet, but we need fats, and we need to have a fair amount of them in our diet. So we're making a switch now, as we've learned this, going away from this low-fat, low-cholesterol diet, and we're getting into healthy fat diets. So all combined, and this exercise, if we're really busy and we can't get out and do some intensive exercise, go for a 20-kilometer bike ride or go for a 3-hour swim or whatever, then we do the interval training, okay? And interval training means you do very intensive exercise, whatever you're doing. It could be jumping jacks, it could be squats, it could be whatever. You do it at maximum capacity for 50 seconds. Then you take a 10-second break, and believe me, those 10 seconds go by awfully fast. And the 50 seconds longer and longer. And try and do it 5 times. I can't get beyond 3. And so you can get very good quality exercise by doing these interval training. And if your knees are bad, as mine are starting to get to be, well, then you do things with your upper body, okay? And you work with the muscles you can use. So interval training is a very good tool. But yes, it affects the entire body. It gives us better spirituality, because you've noticed coming to church, what happens to most people, those of us who are preachers see it, 3/4 of the audience are sound asleep. Some start to snore. Yeah, exactly. Right. So I'm tempted when that happens and I'm looking out of the audience and I see 2 or 3 people snoring, and so I'm nodding off. We just say, all right, up you go. Let's do some interval training for a few minutes and get you going again. Yes, it is. Anyhow, let's close with a word of prayer. Tomorrow night, we're going to be talking about the gut-brain connection, okay, and the role that diet plays in brain health. We got some exciting information we're going to give you, and there's just, it's an area, along with epigenetics, the area of the gut-brain connection and the biome is an exploding area in medicine right now. We are realizing, I'll give you a secret for tomorrow night, we have 10 times the number of bacterial cells in our body as we do our own cells. 10 times as many. And these bacterial cells in our gut, in our urinary tract, in our reproductive tract, on our skin, in our eyes, are essential for our health. And so basically, instead of being an organism, we are a community of organisms that provide for the well-being. And you've maybe heard of H. pylori, this bacterium that causes stomach ulcers and stomach inflammations and everything. It is our best study tool for ancestry. If we were to take your H. pylori and my H. pylori and study them in the lab, I could determine how far we would go back before we had a common ancestor. And they estimate that there's not one of us on this planet that is more than 10 generations from a common ancestor. Wow. It's really, really remarkable stuff. So these bacteria are just powerhouses of information. And so we're going to be looking at how to keep them healthy, how they work with the brain. We have prebiotics, postbiotics, probiotics, and we're going to be looking at all of that tomorrow night. Okay, so don't miss tomorrow night. Bring a friend, and let's bow our heads. Okay, Father, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Unfortunately, sin and human selfishness and an overacted limbic system have damaged us seriously. But praise you for wanting to heal us and restore us into health again, to restore our relationships with you, with each other, to restore our bodies and remake them new, and to renew our minds. We, Father, want you to do this for us. So we pray that you will come and fill us with your Spirit, that you will give us healing, restoration, and salvation every minute of every day, we pray in your name. Amen. Have a good evening. Sleep well. We'll see you tomorrow, 6 o'clock.